Okay, we have again, thank you very much for coming back up and giving another presentation. Dr. Hendrickson, take it away.
All right, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
It's thinning out. It is Friday afternoon. So after all of that, I just stuck this first slide in there just to give you a sense that we're going to go somewhere else here. So first of all, if you haven't figured it out, humor keeps me motivated. So what I'll talk about, what Marisa asked me to talk about, was a simple introduction to tree risk and how practically you can apply it. So, okay, we'll do that. And of course, we first start because there's jokes around the corner everywhere. There's a little arborist humor, get us going. So if you don't have a sense of humor, you're in the wrong place. So we all do risk assessments, and it's very simple. All risk assessment is what's the likelihood of something happening, and what are the consequences? So here's just somebody ice fishing. What's the likelihood of an event happening? So, and for those of you who have seen the electrical demonstration, what's the likelihood of anything happening? What are the consequences? And for those of you who are old as I am, the guy in the right bottom corner won't be that unfamiliar to you. Now, if we extrapolate this to trees, some of you probably know people who do tree work like this, where you pull up a loader, put a ladder in it as far as it'll go, get off the ladder, get in the tree, and then prop another ladder up there, or you're shearing shrubs by stacking ladders this way. Anyway, just to give you a sense that people do risk assessments, and either they don't care or they're very risk tolerant. But as far as trees, one observation I've had for 30 plus years in the business, people are afraid of trees. Most of the audiences with ArborSystems that I've talked to over the years, they're afraid of trees. And you know, the fact is, it's mostly because we don't know a lot about them. And I've had a few conversations over the last couple of days about how little we really know. But you know, if you haven't heard this, maybe you don't hear it the same way in this part of the world, but the one I like the best, if you come back from East, and as you know, I'm from Jersey, so one of the things I used to hear when people wanted their trees down, it's a dirty tree. You know, why don't you just move to a place with no trees? But anyway, the point has always been, arborists and homeowners, if they look at a tree and they get scared about it, it is scary. Its perception is reality. And what happens? You know, they perceive that the tree could fail. I know a guy who organizes track for a chapter, and he's well trained. And I was talking to him, and he was talking about a tree we both know. It's out in the middle of nowhere, and he said, but it could fall and hurt somebody. Sure, if they were there. But the point is, he's paying no attention to what I'm going to talk about, which is to think through the problem. And if you look at what track says, if you take it, or if you just know about trees, failures are actually infrequent. I have a couple of videos from when our big storm came, which was Sandy in 2012, 80-mile-an-hour winds. How many trees did we lose? A fraction of 1%. Not many. So failures are actually pretty infrequent. Trees are pretty amazing and standing up. The other part of this is, as I think it was Ann said yesterday, if you ask two arborists who've had track to compare trees, they'll disagree. Well, the whole point of track is that you really need to practice your craft. By the way, anybody here track have that qualification? Oh, so you know this. If you practice it every day, you integrate it into the way you look at trees. But if you just filled out the form and got the qualification, I still know people who don't really know much about it. So we didn't have a standard, and so before this, and so somebody would see a cavity in a tree and they'd become utterly hypnotized, or thump on it, which I did for years. And if it was at all hollow, you took it down. That's why we needed a standard. Back then, before 2013, I don't know this guy, but he's becoming part of what James Cassidy called soil. It was very simple. All the tree had to have was a defect. Pretty simple. It could be limbs, it could be a lean, it could be any kind of defect that you got your eye. And then you needed a target. Simple enough, right? And that is when you started to say, it's a hazard tree. And back then you would see ads. Now, I don't see it so much anymore, but there were ads from a lot of tree companies, free hazard tree evaluation. And then it went to court, and the judge said, if you're calling it a hazard tree evaluation, I'm assuming you already did the evaluation and called it hazardous. So they sort of did away with that. You don't see that anymore. And now you can have a highly defective tree full of defects, and it won't be a risk tree or a hazard tree at all. So it's not that simple. So along came our new standard. And I'll give the ISA credit. A lot of people put a lot of time into the idea, and there's a lot that's new. So among the things about people disagreeing, the more you practice the craft of track, and the more you think, and really track is about systematic thinking, about critical thinking, which I'll mention. But the idea is you'll get better consensus. And I have found this is true because I've taught it for a long time, and I find that when you go outside, the consensus narrows down to pretty good agreement after a while. And you still have to understand that every tree is different. I talk to physicians because I know too many of them now at my age. And, you know, every patient is different. You're not the condition. You're a patient. So what track does that's different, you know, this was a no-brainer tree, right? In the days before, it had defects, and, you know, and so we were in such a rush to take these down. But the term, that's why I did call the talk, there's why are there no hazard trees anymore? It's because there aren't. The spoiler alert is that it's high risk if you're going to talk about trees that used to be hazards. So hopefully you'll start, maybe this will provoke you to just change how you've been talking about trees. But really, the form that track gives you and the classes you go through is trying to make you think systematically about a tree. I find myself, I had this conversation yesterday, what am I missing? Is there anything I'm not looking at that I should? And the track protocol helps you fill in those gaps. So no jumping to conclusions, we're not getting our exercise that way. It's about critical thinking. It's trying to think through the problem. And so the credential, for those of you that have it, by the way, if you're doing any tree work, you need to have a hard hat on. You need to have your PPE. But for those of you who don't have it and want to get it, it's because the ISA and a lot of us, I'm helping write ordinances in the state of New Jersey for a lot of places because through my position in the Shade Tree Federation, we do a lot on tree ordinances. And in every case, I say try to get a track person because you're going to get a lot more expertise and a lot more reasonable answers from a person who's had track. And so, you know, this is what you take it. It's a 2-day class and $750. It's good for 5 years. I just lapsed. I talked to the ISA. They said, no, you got to start over. I said, I'm 74. They said, yeah, but it's good for 7 years. When I'm 81, I'm going to be dabbing the drool off my chin. I'm not going to worry about evaluating trees, so I'm not going to bother. But anyway, this is what the ISA is and that assumes I'm upright. Or as we say in the tree business, I'm still green side up. But this is what the ISA is out there saying. So what's the basis? Almost every risk assessment in every other area of life uses a matrix. And It's really, and all these things, I just took that off the internet. You know, I had to look up what Sarbanes-Oxley is, make sure nobody's stealing your money. But almost all risk assessment, and I'm not familiar with it elsewhere, but I'll take it on faith, that if you just reason through this using a matrix, you can do this. A person in arboriculture, in horticulture, you really don't need to do track. It's like if you knew that there was LEED and sites, and if you were in development, LEED was for energy safe building, energy efficient buildings, and sites was to have the same thing in landscapes. The truth is everybody figured out how to do it, and you don't hear about it as much anymore. So if you look at it, what it really says is the key thing to pick up here is look at the categories. The categories are like rare to almost certain. It's not probability. Probability, like numbers, oh, there's a 30% probability. It's certainly, that implies a whole lot of calculation and objectivity. Track still requires an arborist or any track person, subjectivity, experience, thinking through the problem. But it's basically what we have is the same thing, and I'll show you that in a minute. But how does track differ and how much more advanced is it? It's, instead of just looking at defects, we look at likelihood of failure. Will it fail? Maybe. It's good to know that, not just that, well, because all trees will fail eventually. And then, of course, it looks at defects. That's still important. That's not like it's thrown out, and there are 7 of them. I'll hit them later. And then here's the stuff that I really love, because I love anything that is new and interesting. And in the last 10 years that track's been around, or 12, I have found this kinds of study utterly fascinating. So for any of you who have engineering backgrounds, that's really cool. And then we never looked at how the trees responded. Trees respond to things on them, and that didn't happen until some engineers came along. So this whole area, and I'm just barely going to touch on it, but it's one of the things that has changed arboriculture in the last 15, 20 years, is tree biomechanics. And it's so fascinating, and there are people who turn it into engineering formulas. I don't even understand it. I just understand that some of this stuff qualitatively and subjective is really understandable and cool. But what if the tree does fail? Might not hit anything. It might. So there could be a target, but what if the tree goes in the other direction? We've probably, if you've worked with trees at all, seen that happen. I've seen it, of course, 1,000,000 times. And then, if it hits the target, what if nobody's near it, or no cattle are in the barn, or no people are in the house? That makes a difference. And then, what if the tree fails and hangs up in another tree, or lands on the silo instead of the house? Things like that. And then, if it does fail and hit the target, could be a so what? If the target's a fence, and it takes $20, $30 to fix a fence rail, so consequences of failure are huge. But there's another thing, and I alluded to this a little bit, is part of the thing in the track introduction says, if you want any of the benefits of trees, you're going to have to accept some risk. There is no such thing as a safe tree. We know that. We've been saying that for decades. So we expect people to have some degree of risk tolerance. I'll come back to this later. So it's as simple as this. It might look complicated. But if you have a reasonable sense of looking at trees at all and some experience, let's use an example of, oh, well, I'll first tell you that the only things you have to remember are IPPI. Imminent, probable, possible, and improbable. And it's a bunch of ways really to say maybe. But if you look at this, if it's imminent, the tree's in the process of failure, well, you're going to call a crew and you're done. And if you say it's improbable, it's not going to fail, you're also done. You just say so. And so most of the action in track goes on between the probables and the possibles and making those decisions. So just as an example, you look at a tree and you say, it's possible that it could fail. And it might hit the target or it might not. Probably an equal chance. And that gives you a word in the matrix, unlikely. But if you look at all the unlikely boxes, what it's really starting to say is, it's not very likely that tree is going to fail based on what you're saying. Look at all the unlikelies in the top. But they give you a second matrix to say, well, if all that happens, what are the consequences? And that entirely depends on what it hits. So if it hits something like a fence, if it's negligible, if it falls across the road and DPW, the Department of Public Works where I live, comes and cleans it up, it's minor, negligible, somewhere in there. And so that gives you a low risk. And of course, you can just keep going through this and go the same story. Oh, it's going to fail, but it's not likely to hit anything. And you run down, and you know, if it's imminent, you know, you're saying, oh my God, but that's still only a moderate risk. That's the hardest one to deal with, actually. A high risk, you come and take the tree down, and a low risk, you don't. But the moderates are the interesting ones to see what the mitigation options are. But anyway, same idea. If you say it's probable and it's could or could not, same story, give you a moderate risk, which is really tough to deal with. So this is a track form, and I didn't put it up there to give you an eye chart to strain your eyes. What it is the same thing. As you look through it, if you read the tree, and we talk about this, our chapter of the ISA is working on a workshop called Reading the Tree. The idea is it's a combination for climbers of a job site safety analysis and for sales reps and anybody else interested to say, if you really read the tree, you know what you're in for. The tree will tell you almost everything. And so I can't resist. I'll be telling you about what I see in these things too. And so this is my objection to the way ISA teaches track. When I learned it, it was how to fill out the form thoroughly. You spend so much time filling out the form that you might miss the tree. I might suggest that what you're doing already, you keep doing. Look at the tree. The tree will tell you everything. You can see by every part of the tree has its history right there in front of you, and you can figure it out. Then you fill out the form, especially because it's a legal document if you go to court. They're going to summon you to bring that along. And if you turn it over on the back side, there's the matrix. But it starts getting interesting. There's some other cool parts about this that most of us never thought about. Could the tree fail? Yeah, sure. In 100 years, absolutely. In 10 years, maybe. So we need to set a time frame because without a time frame, it doesn't work at all. So what the default has worked at, and I use this, is about 3 years. It works pretty well. Some people have asked me to do it annually, but 3 years are pretty easy. And then you look at all these targets, and they're the same targets that were always there, except for one more, activities. So if their activities are disrupted, I saw in one place there was a softball game that they tried to keep going as a storm was coming in. A tree providing shade behind the backstop landed on the backstop. Game had to be stopped. There's the activity. So there was the activity that was disrupted. And it's like same thing, tree across the road, a tree that falls on a playground so the kids can't use it. Nobody was there, but now they can't use it. Activities are disrupted. Then it's not just the targets, that there's a target. It's what kind of target? Static targets. If you're living in this neighborhood, this is Brooklyn, New York, cars never move. I don't know why people have them. Because if you pull out, there's another car there instantly. It's almost like a static target. But if you're going down a boulevard or a tree-lined street, then that you have mobile targets, and if you have a picnic table, that's a movable target. And if you have that, that's a movable target. Oh, you've seen that happen. So it's good to know what those are, what those kinds of targets are. And it tells you a lot about how to evaluate risk. But there's this other wrinkle that I think is really cool, so I'll mention it. It's occupancy rate. What if no one's there? And it's like the same thing. There are probably roads that are busy during the day and empty at night. I used to use an example of New York Botanical Garden. It's full of trees and full of people. But when it closes, there's no one there. So the occupancy rate is really important. I once did a report on a bunch of trees at what it was an abandoned estate. But for 2 weeks in the summer, it was a camp for kids. And they said, restrict your analysis to those 2 weeks. So it's easy, but you need to know about frequency of occupancy. Because if nobody's there, it doesn't matter. So, people in a house might be a 3, might be a frequent. The house is a 4, it's always there. Utility wires are a 4, they're always there. And cars, maybe they're a 3, I don't know. So like rare is like, I use one for a cemetery in New York where, again, I keep thinking of James Cassidy, a cemetery, it's just people building soil. I know, we're all going to dream about it. So, it was almost comical. It was a big, what they used to call a landscape cemetery, and there was a spectacular copper beach. And there was this beautiful stone next to it. There was occupancy by people was rare, but occupancy by the stone was constant. A huge limb fell off the beach, took off the head of the goddess that was on top of the memorial. So she was there a constant. So practically speaking, with all this background that's, to me, kind of interesting, and hopefully to you, because it might change how you look at tree risk, what do you need to know? This is what I didn't hear. I never heard this taught in track, but I've heard engineers say it. And I'm not an engineer, but all you need to know is failure occurs when load exceeds strength. Simple. And is that new? I don't know. It was to me the first time I heard it. And what are the loads? I already said it. You have typically wind, ice, snow, gravity, and then strength is like the decay I mentioned that got people nervous. Decay, defects, and there's other site factors which I'll hit. But if you look at this kind of image, this is what engineers are looking at. How much load can like a beam take before it shatters? How much load will a tree take before it fails? But what we've always looked at historically, and most of us do, is the perceived loss of strength, and I'll come back to that. We've always focused on that. But back in the 90s, and maybe even before, German engineers, there was a guy named Klaus Matic who was famous because he was a BMW suspension strut engineer who got interested in trees. But there were a bunch of others. And what did they say? I'm making this quote, put this quote in because it just tells you how to look at trees. It's like the degree of hollowness is unimportant. Something new for a lot of us. Did I do that? No. So if you don't know about load and wind and ice and snow, you don't know. It doesn't matter how hollow the tree is. Asking the amount of sound wood is pointless. There used to be a 1/3 rule. If your still tree had 1/3 of its wood, forget it. It's old, it's outdated, and if you have a long lever, meaning a tall tree, it's more likely to be prone to failure. It's the same idea as if you stick your arm out the window of a car all the way. It's like a tall tree, long, long lever arm, and it's more likely to blow over. If you pull your arm in, it's not so likely to blow over. Our big example of this, and I suspect is coming for you, is ashes. Everything in the fraxinus that we know about, no fraxinus. There's only 2 kinds, treated and dead. I've never heard of any resistance. So arborists found out the hard way. People were climbing them, putting a line in it, and the branches were breaking out. And if you've seen, I know you have Siberian elms, and if you have a dead elm that falls, it shatters. It doesn't break the way other wood does. Same with ashes now. So they fall. But it has changed our vendors at our meetings, because now you see these $1 million, or somebody else said, nah, they're only $750, grapple saws. You can't put a climber up. You can't reach it with a bucket. So you get in with these grapple saws, which go up there and take the tree down. Do they cost a fortune? Yeah, but when I used to put 24 or 27 hours on a tree with a crew of 3, they'll have that tree down in an hour or hour and a half. And on the right, spider lifts. You can't get into backyards where people have backyards and ash trees. Can't climb it, can't reach it. You either get a crane, which is ridiculous to reach over your house, or you get a spider lift. Everybody back east has a spider lift. So it's really, we really learned a lot about strength loss in ash trees. But the cool thing, let me get into what I think is some of the coolest stuff that comes into biomechanics. And that is wind in trees, because this is the biggest load that a tree ever faces is wind. So this is a calorie pair that was in my front yard the night of Sandy. As the wind started to get to 40 to 50, it got to about 85 near my house. So if you look and wait just a little bit, you'll see that sort of, see the gusts there? There's a whole lot of information in this picture that I'll talk about a little more in the next few minutes. And the biggest one is drag. I used to put up a picture of an arborist with a chainsaw in a tutu. I don't do that anymore. It's politically incorrect. So anyway, but what's interesting about this, and until there were tree biomechanics to talk about, I never knew that when wind speed doubles, the load on the tree goes up 4 times. It's an exponential function, a log function. So for example, you hear this sort of thing. If the wind goes from 10 to 30, it's going up 9 times the drag on the tree, the friction that pulls on the tree crown. And so this gets kind of interesting as to when I hear on your news about how high the winds are getting, and the storms now are windier, this starts to become more important. But the cool thing about trees is they change their drag coefficient. You all know this. Back east, eastern white pines will deflect their branches, change their drag coefficient and their crown shape until they snap. So some look like climbing ladders because all their low branches are broken off until you get up to the more flexible branches. So it's going to vary between species, but you've probably seen this. And my only question is, you know, do you think about it? Because I think it's really cool. And this will get into me. So Marisa asked me to talk about the effect of pruning and tree risk, and I will a little bit. But most of the time, the wind, if you watch it on a tree crown when the tree is in leaf, will go around it. It doesn't go through it so much. And so that's where the drag coefficient changes as the tree deflects. It's kind of cool. The way that it's very much like a car in a wind tunnel or a NASCAR. I used to say that Congress passed a law that we all had to watch at least one NASCAR race, but I don't anymore. But, and as winds increase, it turns out that the safety factor of trees is pretty substantial. And a tree will withstand winds pretty much up around 70 miles an hour before failure can occur for anything. And in fact, that's what did it for Sandy. A lot of trees stood. That calorie pair of mine failed, but it wasn't until the wind got up into the 80s that it finally failed. So trees are pretty adaptable. They'll change shape, they'll lean, they'll bend, the roots will do it. And it's, so they're pretty cool that way. But there was an Australian engineer I'll talk about, and you know, trees fail in gusts, so I don't know how well you can see it, but it's multiple gusts. It's not steady wind. It causes failure. So you'll see it, 1 gust, 2 gusts. What you didn't see in that video is that there's an arborist who is looking for work that shows up pretty quickly. Yeah, you'll see the arborist here in the picture in a second after the tree fails. Here he comes. Some of you have probably done this. Anyway, so I've always been interested in how trees work. And along came this Australian engineer named Ken James in 2002. And I'm not, again, it's not an eye chart, and I'm not trying to overwhelm you, but some of the things he said, simple sentences. The energy from the wind is dissipated by the, I know it might be small, so I'll read it. Dissipated by the tree using a complex damping mechanism. Okay, this is getting interesting. How does the tree respond to wind? It's minimizing the flow of energy to the trunk so the trunk doesn't fail. Whoa, this is getting my attention. How does it do that? Leaf drag. The leaves are doing a damping. And it says, okay, how's that? Hydraulic damping by the leaves, mass damping by the side branches, and the tree, whole tree, because it's viscoelastic, it's twisting, it's turning, it's doing, and I don't want to anthropomorphize this too much, but the tree's doing everything it can to stay upright, because all a tree cares about is leaving descendants. It doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to have many branches, it just has to leave seeds and acorns and descendants. And like all good science, it was really elementally excellent. It was just two sensors, an anemometer for wind speed and an inclinometer to see how the tree bent. What he said was this: if you take, picture a big block of cement, and I'm going to try to push that, and that's not moving, that's what's on the right. Once I get it moving, and it's on a spring, it's probably going to come right back, and so would a single stem. And it would look pretty much like an inverted grandfather clock or a metronome. This is what people think trees do. And there was a guy who basically was the father of arboriculture named Alex Shigo and said, a tree without branches is not a tree. So what happens? And yeah, it doesn't do that. This is what it does. So if you think about this, you've got a smaller mass now. That tree is being pushed this way. And if somebody pushes you you're from behind, your arms typically go like that. You're dampening that force. Or if somebody pushes you from the front, you throw your arms forward. You're doing partial damping. So if you look at that second mass, you can move that more. But the force on the movement on the second mass is less. And as you start to add these up, here's the oscillation. That's up and down, and it starts, and it's back and forth like a guitar, tuned guitar or violin. And that is where the problems come from, when you get a harmonic motion. And the coolest thing that Ken James found, put one branch on there, maybe two, it damps out. You add them up into a tree, and that oscillation goes practically flat. And what essentially the tree is doing, and you know, you need a leap of imagination, but I find it so interesting that nature can do this, is trees are actively detuning themselves. So any of you who are musicians, I should have talked to James about this, any of you who are musicians know how bad a detuned string or a drum head or anything sounds. And that's what trees are actively doing. They're detuning their structure so that no harmonic damaging motion can be set up. So his model went from adding a few branches to adding a lot. And then what you also add in, another wrinkle, is the force on it. The loads can be going this way, that way. They might not be the same. They're going to be all over the tree. And essentially what you've got is a tree full of springs trying to keep those masses from moving down to the stem, which I think is really cool. And the other part of this damping mechanism, it can go in all kinds of directions. And if you've been in a tree on a windy day, if you're an arborist who's a climber, you've felt or seen or experienced all of these motions. The trees are going, branches are going up and down, they're twisting, they're torquing, and they're going side to side. And what Ken James found with his meters is, it's like, although the motion appears everywhere, they're damped out. Under wind loads, the tree never sets up any kind of an oscillation. And what it is for those of you who have ever heard of chaos theory, it's random motion but within limits. So he calls this his ball of string, and when he shows it as a video, I mean, I stole it from him, he shows it as a ball of string. And the tree moves all over the place, but within limits, but it's random. What you can't quite see there is no movement duplicates itself. So it's amazing how trees do this to keep out that harmonic motion, which would cause failure. So this is in 2 minutes instead of the half hour the other one was. And so there's where the wind's coming from, and you can see it's all over the place. So now I go back to the night of Sandy, and this is a pin oak in front of my house. And if you watch it for a little bit, look at how each branch is actually independent and random. And that's why it's still standing. Look at the main stem. Winds are up about 50 miles an hour, nothing moving. And so once I realized what I was looking at, I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in trees, and I'm learning a lot. So that's why I get kind of enthusiastic about it. But people have started to measure it and study it, and if you're looking at it, the movement on the stem at the near the base is hardly at all, a little more as you go up, codoms more. Secondary branches are doing most of the work, but when leaves are on, they're doing a lot of the work. So this is in another place where people are making soil for James Cassidy, but it was a very windy day, and that is a big old white oak in Delaware. And if you look at that, you can see everything I'm talking about. I think it's really cool because the tree is not, there's no force, no load on the lower stem because the branches, the twigs, they're all mass damping it. It's really fascinating. And if you've experienced codominant stems and said, oh, what do we do with a codom? I guess we cut one off or we leave it. But if you look at it, they're operating randomly. And so there's that chance that because they're at random, they could hit a critical angle and fail. And I happened to be driving around Albuquerque and said, yeah, that's what happens, because that was a willow. And this is why arborists put in cables, is to to dampen that random motion, let it go this way, and let it not go this way. It can go back and forth a little bit, but that's why we put in cables. This is another one. I saw this cabling job again down in town. I don't know where. I was driving around, and I don't know that you can see them, but it's the worst cabling job in North America. Probably a homeowner job, some kind of screws, turnbuckles, might be clothesline for all I know, but it's nothing near ISA standards. Another thing to think about, especially if you live someplace where there's trees that were planted in a row, is I got involved with the New York Botanical Garden. They had an alley, a double alley of tulip trees, 125 years old, that they were concerned because there were minor failures. And I said, if you look down on those trees, it's one organism. Take one out, and wind is going to flow through the rest and increase the possibility, the likelihood of failure. And if you look at it here, this is near Princeton, New Jersey, or this is another part of town. These are pretty well spaced, and they're pretty well open grown. But the idea is, some of us would call it the Venturi effect. The wind funnels faster through a narrow area. But this is, in the track form, it wants you to think about this. It has a layer in the form where it says, is it protected by other trees? Because that makes a lot of difference. If you've ever seen like a pine plantation or a pine woods, one tree fails, and there were a lot of them put in by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s and Boy Scouts in the 50s, very dense. And as they start to fail, the wind starts howling through the rest, and the next thing you know, you got a lot of failures. So it asks about wind funneling in this. So I have dealt with a lot of people over the years, probably you have too, where somebody said, that's a really defective tree, we should take it down. It's in a row, there's no load on it. It doesn't matter if strength goes way down, if there's no load because it's buffered by other trees. It's another thing that most people don't think about that you might want to. So how do humans duplicate this? You know, people don't know anything about trees, but they have some sense of this. So I use this example. This is in Taipei, and that's 1,500 feet tall approximately. And so it's windy, typhoons and all those sorts of things, cyclones. So what did they do? They put a mass damper inside of it. That's the guy that designed it, and it weighs 728 tons. And what happens is this: as the winds hit the building, the mass damper takes all of that load and dissipates it. So, and it looks like this in real time. So if some of you have ever been up a tree and had to take the top out because you were in a hurry, this happens to be in Australia. But if all that mass damping in the crown goes away, somebody's going to have to be the mass damper. So it's grainy because it's really old, and I stole it from Ken James. But so when you start looking at these things and you start pruning trees, especially when you start pruning, consider the impact of your pruning on loading. So this is just down the street from my house. And these people thought, well, the idea is to get these people their money's worth by taking out every leaf out to the tips. So that's what we would also call lion's tailing. I don't know if you use the term here, but it's pretty common back east. And that's sort of before and after. And, you know, if you look at how where thinning is in the ISA standards, it's not there anymore. Right? The pruning standard, the A300 pruning standard, thinning is not there because there's nothing good about it. It's misunderstood. People do it for mostly, as I think I say here, it's live branch removal to produce business. Nature doesn't do anything like that. A lot of pruning simulates what nature would do. If we take off a dead branch, we're just assisting it to get a branch collar closure. So, and the same story, if you lion's tail or over thin a tree coming out from the inside, the wind will go through it. Now you have those long lever arms and a lot of sail. You don't want that. That's why the ISA standard says keep all the interior branches. If you've read it, that's what it says. And the guru of all this, Ed Gilman, puts it this way. Thinning pulls all the carbon out of the tree and puts it in the dump. Puts it, you know, or runs it through the chipper. But there's a typical Florida tree that Gilman looked at. But what happens? It's not what a tree does. And what will happen, at least if you've got a healthy tree, well watered, that tree's going to sprout unless you hit it so hard you kill it. So that's the same tree that Ed looked at 2 years later. And again, excessive sprouting that you'll see. That's really hard to rebuild a natural crown from a tree that's full of epicormic sprouts. And so that's one. But as you're getting the idea of how trees work in wind, do you really want to start taking all the lower branches off and making it a little feather duster at the top? No, it's out of the standard also. Raising, elevation, that word is not in there anymore. And the reason is, if you look at it very simply, this is what people called the center of pressure height. And if you take the bottom off, it moves up. Now you've got much more of a long lever arm, and you know, it's just, you know this from simple physics, that's more likely to bend and break. So I looked at this for years. I used to teach a long tree risk class, a workshop in Connecticut. And while we were doing it, they were clearing the highway to make more room. And I said, look at that beautiful hickory. It was a nice hickory. And then, not that tree, but that's where they were clearing it. And they left this tree that was in the woods, and they left it in the open. And I said, oh boy, there's no taper. If you've ever listened to Ed Gilman or know anything about structural pruning, one of the things you do is leave those low branches on because they'll help build taper in the tree. So if you look on the right, you could see what has happened. That tree took all those small laterals and thickened them out, so all those leaves are making photosynthate to give that tree taper. So it'll be stronger at the base. I used to call this the Dirty Harry School of Arboriculture because if a storm comes while that tree hasn't built taper, the tree's done. It's going to snap because it's up there like a Q-tip. But if it's got enough time then to put out all that foliage and incorporate all that wood into the lower stem, well, then you're all set. And it's like, yeah, do you feel lucky? I hope you do. So if you're going to approach wind resistance in a tree, the ISA A300 has a perfect answer for you, proper reduction. It's not necessarily that easy to do, but there's the same story. If you reduce the longest ends back, you can reduce that center of pressure height, center of load. But the idea is, it's not topping, right? It's reducing the top of the trees, bringing them back. We used to call it drop crotching when I got into the business. You bring it back to the next 1/3 size stem that would take over the dominance. And if you think about it, it's not topping, thank goodness, but people sometimes substitute it. But it's how nature prunes trees. If you've seen trees in wind, there's twigs all over the place. Nature's reducing it. So that's the right way to do it. So I talked about loads. I talked about how to prune for them. But what about all these decay and defect that people used to freak out about? You know, it's tree risk analysis before track always focused on this. And it's all people cared about because it was an indicator of strength loss. We never thought about loads. We just thought about strength loss. So if the strength is low, a smaller load can cause failure. That's what we know now. These are the defects that are out of the ISA. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you know what they are because you've seen them all and you've dealt with them. You know, whether it's leans, but these are what freak people out. But how much strength loss is too much? That? Why is it standing? In fact, I used to call this talk, or a version thereof, why is this tree still standing? And, you know, maybe it isn't what it seems. So what is the tree thinking? What is it doing? What are its nefarious little plans? It's response growth. We used to call this adaptive growth, compensatory growth, but in the old days, before track, we never considered it. And I always wondered what this meant when I got into the business. I didn't know. So if you see what, there's a very good pathologist. He's written a couple of books named Chris Luley, who comes out of New York State. And he refers to this as phloem exposure. But what it is you get a hardwood tree, for example, and this is a sugar maple. As the tree expands, putting on wood where it needs it, it'll expose that salmon-colored wood. I don't know, I haven't seen it here. Didn't have the time to go look at your trees enough. But it's new wood in response to loads. And, you know, it can be all kinds of things. Swelling, ridges, bulges. You just have to read the tree. The tree will tell you tons. So there's this thing that Klaus Matic and people like him came up with called the constant strain hypothesis. And all it means is trees put the wood where they need it. So those trees out in the open, they develop taper because as the tree moved, that's where they needed the strength. And it's funny that James was talking about self-optimizing soils. That's what trees do as well. And there's a picture. This is a red oak. And as soon as I saw that, I started looking more carefully to see what is this telling me? Where are the loads on the trees that this wood is a response to? Same story. I realized, there was a parking lot, and they took down another tree. This tree grew like that in response. It's what we used to call ram's horns. I was always confused. What is it that is causing this? And it's because the trees are doing everything they can to allocate wood so they can remain standing. And one of the phrases that came out of this is, you know, the stronger the breeze, the stronger the trees. The more it moves, the more they're going to send carbohydrate to the base of the tree to stabilize it. So if you, and I'll come back to this, if you look at a tree and see that it's wide at the base, it's probably always been open grown, and it's probably always been putting on wood there because of the breeze. This is a really old slide, but it's still really instructive. We used to talk about this all the time. This is sugar maple. It's a limb that we used to call a hazard beam when we did the old kind of tree risk assessment, which just meant it's a force, a load, perpendicular to the direction of the branch, so what? But what you see in this picture, we used to talk about tree failures and used this as an example. Then I started looking at it with track eyes and said, wait a minute, look at all that response growth at the bottom of this limb. And look at how the wound is closing and putting response growth on there. So I was once doing this class for what was called the Million Trees Project in New York City. And they wanted to empower a lot of inner city kids that knew nothing about trees. So I'm talking about this particular tree, and one kid who has very little experience with trees said, I've seen that before. Yeah, stretch marks. So any of you who go back far enough to see steroids in the gym, or women who have been pregnant, you know about stretch marks, and maybe others of you lost a lot of weight anyway. The point is, I thought that was brilliant. I still use it, because that's what the tree is doing. It's the wood expanding underneath, causing these stretch marks. So then you get into like, okay, so now I'm starting to learn about how trees are growing in response to defects, decay, and loads. And then it's the engineers that did it again. It's not the cavity in the tree, the weakness, that's important. It's how much is still there, not what's missing. And by the way, the young woman on the left has become a phenomenally successful regional manager for Bartlett. But that was a pretty cool tree. And what you see there is that wood wrapping around the cavity. As you probably know, that kind of callus wound wood, that has a higher specific gravity. So it's making up for a lot for that cavity. So to me, it's also really interesting kind of stuff. So I stopped thinking about what was missing and started thinking about what's there and how am I reading this? Am I catching everything? And so this is just a picture off the interweb. If you look about it, the key word here is new. So if you know anything about Alex Shigo and walls 1 through 4, if that's familiar, I hope it is to some, wall 4 is new wood. So if you look at that cavity, there's a tree that was there. It is dead, it is gone, it is decayed, it is James Cassidy's soil. But what's there now? First of all, look at the taper. The tree is obviously healthy. You can read the tree because it is moving all the wood it needs to the base to give you a wide base. For those of you, in this picture, I use this guy for a reason. I love to watch sumo. I think it's the greatest sport on earth. But if you look about it, anybody that played a sport or did anything like dance or anything, getting a wide base, squatting down, is always important. It gives you that fundamental foundation. And so what are trees doing? The very same thing. They're creating that wide base of greater strength. And there's something else in this. There's other trees around. So buffering those loads, which I showed earlier, that tree is probably there because the road went through and let wind come in. But you can tell so much of this. You can read this history. It's right there. But that tree put down all of that wood at the base because it was also buffered. Now, I used to use this slide. This is on a Civil War battlefield, and I believe it's Antietam. And it's near a place called Burnside Bridge, a very famous part of the battle. And I used to use this as the no-brainer for removal back when I was doing this in the early 2000s. But there's so much more information in this than I ever saw. First of all, look at the taper. It's massive at the base. It has a very long live crown ratio with lots of small branches. And if you've ever heard Ed Gilman talk about keeping branches small in structural pruning, this tree is doing that. It's got lots of small branches. It's got lots of mass damping. It's also very healthy because look at the massive size of the root flares. So there's people who are walking in and out of that. But the fact is, somebody knew enough to put a picnic table under it. So it's like, you know what? I have been so wrong for so long. I just didn't know. But here's the other part of that I just mentioned. The old tree that was there during the Civil War, it's long gone. That's new wood. That's Alex Shigo's Wall 4. That's not decayed. And that's why the tree is standing. And think about all the storms that tree has experienced. So here's just another example I pulled off the internet. The same story. Look at the root flare. Look at the cavities. It should go down. Leans are the same story. People used to freak out about leans. And if you look, it's a straightened lean. It's what's called a self-corrected lean. Not all leans are bad. Don't just look at the base. If a tree has time, it will adjust. The other part of that tree, response growth. Oh, sometimes when you go, next time you go out and look at trees, look at the roots. They'll tell you most of the story. If they're asymmetrical, if you don't have a perfectly radial root system, look around and see where the roots are. They'll tell you what the loads are on the trees. So I saw that one, I said, oh, that tree's not going anywhere. It took all the carbohydrate it needed and it put it at the base. It's self-optimizing and it's a constant strain hypothesis, et cetera. So I look at this, I said, oh, let's go look at that tree more closely. Of course, the tree tells you everything you need to know. So I was with my wife in a park. I missed one slide. Let's see, can I go back? Yeah. And I saw this. You can tell everything that happened. There's a whole story here. My wife says, what now? But if you're an arborist, you know how this is. So I stop and say, look at this. Look at what's here. What did they do? They saw the cavity and they freaked out. What they didn't see, look at the trees fighting to put down carbohydrate, to put down response growth. Look at the size of those, of the opening and the amount of tissue that's there. Look at this and the size of these roots. And of course, they did what any reasonable people would do in a park. They mowed over them until they killed them. So look at that. I mean, is that cool? And so I said, I would bet you that if that tree, look at the tissue that the tree allocated to try to keep itself up. It might have died in the attempt because the turf is so good that it probably killed the tree by competition. But anyway, I thought that was one of the coolest things I ever saw. So here's kind of a quiz. This was one of the coolest spots I ever went to as an arborist because this tree was the second tree, I shouldn't tell you that, it crushed a new BMW. I love it when cars get crushed and nobody gets hurt. And it hit a new BMW, but all the evidence you need is in the picture. Anybody want to take a chance on why that tree failed? Yeah.
The tree on the opposite side, the stump, that was a taller tree one time growing with it as a community. When that left, it left it vulnerable to...
Exactly. Yeah, did you hear that? Look at the stump. The story is here. They saw the cavity. They freaked out. They took the tree down. Now the other tree is not buffered. There's no protection. That tree had root decay, and so what happened was now there's a load where there was no load, and that tree failed. The good news is, and you can see the truck tracks right by the old stump. The good news is about this is that previous tree the guy had it taken down because he was afraid of it because where he parked his BMW. So anyway, it's all there. But that's really good. If I had one of those gold stars, I'd give it to you. But the strength of the fallen tree was very low. But some of you may live in homes like this. Everybody does in New Jersey except me. We call these starter castles. McMansions are an old word. Starter castle works much better. But all these edge trees were decayed, extensively decayed. But there was no load while they were in the woods. As soon as they were exposed, they started to fail. So you can see how decayed they were. But until a lot was cleared, they were okay. And it didn't require much wind. It was what some people would call a calm day failure. So kind of interesting. So the bottom line in all this, consider this when you look at trees. Stability is the rule rather than the exception. Trees really do a lot to keep themselves upright. And in fact, people say, how's your health? I say, I'm still green side up. But trees do a lot. They can tolerate huge amounts of decay and loads, or they wouldn't have evolved as they have. I once went to an ISA convention in '09. Put some faith in the tree's evolved capacity to remain upright. I love it. Just got to think a little when you look at trees. So I was going to finish, but I threw these in. You know what that place is? There it is, George Washington's house. That was Carria Illinoisensis. And so that had been under Bartlett's care, the company I used to work for decades. And they said, is it a safe tree? And before there were track, that's what we said, because there's no such thing as a safe tree, but it's not going to fail. We did the whole track analysis, and we said it's low risk because you can't go lower than that. Because we didn't think it was going to fail, so we said low. The likelihood of failure was low. But what if it hits Mount Vernon? Even if the likelihood of impact was medium and it took you to a low risk, you talk to the National Park Service and they turn around and say, it's Mount Vernon. It's George Washington's house. Down. Depends on risk tolerance. So they had no patience for a big tree next to Mount Vernon. And also George Washington didn't plant it. So, all right, so now we move to two beautiful tulip trees at Thomas Jefferson's home, also on the nickel. The trees aren't, but the house is. And they looked and said, they thumped on it and said, hollow. And we did the same thing. Low risk, really low risk. They have all the good information, but they thumped on it, hollow. Well, they thumped on it. And then they looked at the other one, which looked great, low risk. Nah, we have no risk tolerance. So anyway, I will leave you with this. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, Dr. Hendrickson, this is known as Read the Cookie, which was a tree. And, this one is yours here. So on behalf of all of us in the crowd and Think Trees, we want to thank you very much.
That is awesome. That is gorgeous.
Yes. It's low calorie, too.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
A lot of growth rings, and I didn't even get a chance to talk about what knots mean, but that's really cool because I got one in here. Thank you so much, everybody.